Today is the 2nd of May, and in the calendar of saints we celebrate the feast of St Athanasius. Now, Canon Collins has asked me to give this overview of his life and the most important features of his contribution to the Church. Very happy to do so. I'm therefore using a lot of material from my church history talks last year. Although I've lost some of the files, I've managed to cobble together enough. To understand Athanasius's life, we have to put him in the historical context of the 4th century. He was born around about 296, maybe 298, something like that. And he was a deacon in Alexandria at a time where the divinity of Christ was being disputed. The divinity of Christ is very clearly found in John's Gospel. It wasn't something that wasn't believed before the 4th century. It was a continuous apostolic tradition. But there were people who followed a priest in Alexandria called Arius, and he was very much up against the bishop, the patriarch of Alexandria, whose name was Alexander. And Constantine, the emperor, who became the first Christian emperor, decided that he wanted the Christian world to be unified essentially behind him. So he called all of the bishops in the church together in one of the first ecumenical council, as it's called, in Nicaea, 325 AD, and asked them to dispute and debate this issue that Arius had raised. And although there were many bishops who had a very clear understanding of the Orthodox theology of Christ, there were others who wavered and disagreed. So the council, in fact, was headed by a bishop called Josias of Cordova, and Athanasius acted as an advisor, as a deacon, to his bishop, the Bishop of Alexandria, as I said, Alexander by name. And this is where Athanasius really cut his teeth. Already, as a relatively young man, he was already a considerable theologian. And it was by and large his work and his influence in the council which ended up in disaster for Arius and this idea that Jesus essentially is a creature and not actually God himself. And although popular belief seems to suggest that this was the end then, that Constantine had sewn it all up and Christian orthodoxy prevailed, it wasn't anything like as simple as that. And after the council, in fact, it didn't actually seem to solve any of the problems. And Arius didn't go away, his supporters didn't go away. A few of them said they'd sign it with their hand, but not with their heart, essentially, the council documents. Eusebius of Nicomedia being one example, bishop and a relative of Constantine. And Athanasius was accused of being a troublemaker to the emperor. And there were all sorts of trumped up charges, including murder and various other nasty things, to try to get Athanasius removed from view. There is a story that the person who Athanasius was supposed to have murdered was actually brought to the trial, and hello, I'm not dead, and all of this is a fabrication, and it was a kangaroo court sort of thing. But nevertheless, Constantine wanted a court, and Athanasius was such a truculent character, so convinced by orthodoxy, rightly, that he refused to compromise and ended up falling foul of the Emperor Constantine. But after Constantine died, it didn't end there. Following Constantine's death, he had 3 sons, and the empire was split between them, and there were various different civil wars and what have you, and ended up that only one of them survived, Constantius II, who was an Arian and a great supporter of Arius, and hated Athanasius with a passion. And Athanasius's absolutely unflinching support of orthodoxy, of this formula which is recited in the Nicene Creed of that the Father and the Son are of one substance. You know, there is not a difference between them substantially. And this was unacceptable to Constantius, who was trying to do what his father did, really, by ensuring uniformity, but he was on the wrong side of the argument. And Constantius was a very violent individual. He killed most of his family members at Constantine, his father's death. And he was very, very single-minded in getting rid of his opponents, including Athanasius. There was a number of councils. There was a council convened at Serdica while his brothers, while Constantius's brothers were still alive, to try and reconcile the issue, but it didn't gain any consensus. Ultimately, not just in Constantius's reign, but also in the reign of Julian the Apostate and Valens, several successive emperors, Athanasius was exiled no less than 5 times. In the beginning, with support from the Western bishops, from the Pope Liberius. Liberius himself was very badly treated by Constantius II and forced to sign a document which weakened the force of Nicaea, even though it didn't repudiate it. But pressure was put on him to essentially relax the Orthodox line on the divinity of Christ. And Athanasius spent quite some time in Egypt, actually under the protection of St Anthony of Egypt, who would hide him from the imperial troops when they came to try to arrest him. And that's by and large a lot of the short story of Athanasius, but a number of his writings survive today, and they are very important writings which are still accessible to us. A lot of those writings, you can find it on New Advent website in the Fathers section. There's his writings, discourse on the incarnation of the Word, which was written actually before the Arian heresy really took place, but very much a theological exposition of the reality of the divine incarnation. He wrote histories very much of his own point of view, really, on the history of the Arians, and from some of his numerous letters and what have you, which are all thankfully preserved and handed down to us in the current day. One final point, we will come across sometimes Athanasius in this period of history if we occasionally come across Jehovah's Witnesses, who I've seen all sorts of different interpretations of this period that Athanasius really, he browbeat the council and he convinced the emperor to overtake the consensus of the bishops, etc., etc., which is absolutely not true. Athanasius was a great advocate for orthodoxy, and he suffered greatly as well for that, and a very brave, very stubborn character, but certainly a marvellous doctor of the church, and marvellous example of sainthood and courage and tenacity for us today.